6 music documentaries present England Still Dreaming.
We only might know 3 chords, but we have one fabulous word, and that's anarchy.
I mean, that reaction next day was phenomenal. I mean, and you couldn't abort it.
It was almost like an atom splitting, you know. The next thing you know, some truck driver had kicked his TV in.
I was into Sex Pistols, right? A bizarre, absurd name. Sex Pistols, I mean, you know.
You just hadn't heard people say those sort of things before, you know.
There ain't no such thing as a punk movement. There was just a bunch of nasty who were out to, like, I don't know what.
And the sound was terrible, but the event was fantastic.
It was such a tight, paranoid, almost well, it was insane, yeah, not almost, mental.
Ever feel you've been cheated? Last week we relived 1976, the year that changed the musical landscape in the UK. With the Sex Pistols, their famous Bill Grundy interview, and the fallout which took punk rock onto the nation's front pages. This week we move the story on from punk's implosion to the present day. I'm Steve Lamacq, and this is England Still Dreaming, Part 2. When Johnny Rotten walked off stage, quitting the Sex Pistols lineup after a gig at San Francisco's Winterland Ballroom on January the 14th, 1978, punk, for many people, was as good as finished. Less than 18 months after the Pistols invaded the tabloid press, punk rock had become unwieldy and uncontrollable, eaten up by the major labels, spat out by the media. Yet here we are, some 30 years on, and punk's spirit is, according to fans and bands alike, still very much alive. Just ask these people. Billy Bragg.
I see that today on the internet. When I see everybody putting their stuff up on MySpace or something like that, it warms the cockles of my heart. It's that old DIY thing. It doesn't matter how glamorous and fabulous or, you know, what the budget for your video was. It matters what you're saying.
Buzzcocks guitarist Steve Diggle.
You didn't know where it was going to go, but it was just mainly, I guess, to inspire people, you know. It wasn't about, like, taking over the world or changing the world. That was too big, but I think it did change a lot of people's attitudes to things, and it is still with us to this day, really, in different ways. You know, it was like a black and white sort of world then, and then it became colourful, you know, a lot of electricity flying around, you know. There was like a kind of sadistic thing about music via the Pistols and stuff, and that made people grow up, you know. It made, like, sort of people like Cliff Richard seem even more like your granny, you know.
Bob Geldof.
I do think that punk, bizarrely, was a forerunner of what happened in 1979 with the election of the Conservative government. What happened was there was going to be, inevitably, a radical political change, and therefore you needed radicalism. So Johnny Rotten was articulating a coming political economic moment. No one expected that to be of the right. No one expected it to be a woman with a handbag. But when she did arrive, she set about whacking anything that was part of the post-war consensus, whether it was the monarchy, whether it was the county shires of the old Conservative Party, whether it was the trade unions. Thatcher, this political phenomenon, radical phenomenon, which people constantly argue about today, was, in my opinion, prefigured by what the Sex Pistols were doing and what Johnny Rotten was saying, I am this. So it was the theatre of the self. And I think it definitely prefigured that in everything that happened.
It's not just the music from the late 70s punk era which we still revere, it's also the influence which punk has had on music scenes over the past 3 decades. In the next hour, we're going to try and follow some of the musical threads which began unravelling after 1976 and 77. In punk's media aftermath, for instance, came its slightly poppier offspring, as the pithily named new wave and power pop bands took punk onto the radio. It also provoked a cluster of more angular, politicised and occasionally danceable post-punk bands, led by the likes of the Gang of Four. It helped provide an opening for the two-tone scene, with the Specials and Madness, and it inadvertently spawned the New Romantics, a mixture of ex-punks and budding starlets who were simply reacting against punk's drudgery chic. This period, from 1978 to 1984, was fascinating to behold.
My name's Richard Jobson, former singer with the Skids, and you're listening to England Still Dreaming on Radio 2. And just in case you forgot, so is Scotland, so is Wales, and so is Ireland. Skids came on the back of all the bands coming to Scotland. I mean, we went down to London pretty early. I mean, we were at the gigs in the Roxy Club. We saw the Banshees at the 100 Club. So, you know, we were in and around, and we were as a band, but did we have a record deal? No, we didn't really come to the fore until late 1977, early 78 is when we started to kick in. But we were the only punk band in Scotland at the time, so we got all the gigs. So at any time the Buzzcocks were coming up, the Damned, you name it, we got the gig because we were the only band available. I remember seeing Mick Jones recently, and he remembered us playing with them when they did their first ever gig in Scotland, and he said you were really terrible, which was really it was quite amusing. Well, I think the Skids certainly fell into the period when punk was already, the death bells were ringing for punk as this kind of revolutionary thing that had happened in this country. And I think we came along at that time where you were meant to be a bit better, you know, and a little bit more improved. But I don't think that's the case. I mean, the stuff that we wrote in the beginning, which was, as I said, you know, from 1977 through to 78, was pretty opinionated and in our sense quite vital to us. I mean, it was songs about being in gangs because we were all gang members at the time. It was about violence because violence was part of your life, and we were young, and violence when you're young and there's nothing else happening in your life and you're fighting other gangs is really exciting. You know, of course, now I'm 46, I look back on that and go, wow, you 22-carat idiot, you know, how could you have done these things? By the time we started to move, the tectonic plates were shifting again, and I think people were really interested in the more art school bands, the more interesting bands who were kind of moving into the kind of synthetic world.
Blondie's Debbie Harry.
What we had to overcome here was the punk, I don't know, whatever it was, mystique, or, you know, everyone was sort of afraid of this punk thing. It was like, you know, a horror show for most people. I mean, we still really weren't totally compatible airplay music, you know, but we were just starting to cross over. It was just the stigma of the punk label, and hence the development of the new wave title.
Once of the Banshees and Adam and the Ants, Marco Perroni.
The thing about Adam and the Ants was it was our attempt to be anti-punk. You know, Adam and I met, we'd known each other vaguely, but we met, and, you know, he'd just gone through this thing with being fired from his own band, you know, and I'd gone through this thing with, like, I didn't know what I was doing, you know, there was nothing happening in music that I wanted to be involved in, and we were thinking similarly, and suddenly we were talking to each other. It all kind of converged into this big thing. It's like, we hate punk, you know, what can we do that's so anti-punk, you know? And we used to go into, you know, we'd sign to CBS or Sony, or CBS as it was then, and we would have meetings with A&R people. They'd go, what do you want to do? I said, well, we're going to have a big stage show, we're going to make pop singles that gets to #1, and we're going to have, like, big cars and makeup. And they go, what do you mean? And I said, no, we're not being ironic. We do want to be like T-Rex. You know, like T-Rex, and like hit singles, like Money, Money, Fame, all those things. You know, we're not trying to destroy it. We want it. That whole punk thing, you read it in The Filth and the Furious. It wasn't ever true. You bought into an idea which was made up.
In the Midlands, the Specials, who would head the flourishing two-tone scene, had a well-placed and surprising early benefactor.
I'd lost all my real belief in the record industry. I'd lost it.
Pete Waterman.
Found out, you know, there was too much business and not enough music. And I'm working on a building site, and literally I heard this noise coming out the Expel Air. You know, it's a pub, and I heard this noise coming out, and I thought, what's that? And I literally went inside, and there were these guys rehearsing. Now, they were called the Automatics, but I loved what they were doing. I mean, I loved what they were doing. I always remember the first track I ever heard them play when I walked in was Too Much Too Young. And they just said, guys, that's a hit.
You've done too much, much too young. Now you're married with a kid when you could be having fun with me.
I sort of became their manager. and work with Jerry. I hadn't met Jerry before. I thought he was a genius. I still think Jerry Dammers is a genius. So I went round the record industry. I took them in the studio at my own cost. We did Too Much Too Young, Jaywalking. We did 4 tracks in Berwick Street Studios. And I took them around the industry, and everybody chucked me out. And I took them to Madonna's label, Sire Records, to Seymour Stein. And it was very funny. Seymour Stein said to me, Pete, stick to John Travolta. This is a pile of crap, you know. And, you know, I walked out, and a friend of mine who was a good journalist, I gave him the tape. I said, look, this band is tremendous. Nobody's taking it serious because I'm involved, because, you know, I'd done Grease. And so I said, look, this is just not right. And he said, well, take the Chris Briggs at Polygram. And Chris Briggs was the first guy who gave him a break. And then, of course, Bernie Rhodes gave him a gig, and suddenly they're on the front of Enemy, and, you know, the rest was history. Again, that gave me another spur to say that, you know, people shouldn't look at people and make judgments. Should listen to what they're doing, and, you know, it doesn't matter what you've done before if you really believe in the project. And I think that's when I said I've got to do this for myself.
From the Specials, Jerry Dammers.
Well, Rock Against Racism was sort of going at the same time as us, because obviously this was a period when the British movement and the National Front, you know, fascist organisations, got a lot of backing around that time. So it was a big issue, and this organisation, Rock Against Racism, sprang up, which was based around, you know, punk bands and reggae bands playing together on the same bill. It developed into a huge thing, and the biggest thing we did was the Leeds Carnival, which was a huge event. We headlined it, you know, and it was all very tense. There was a National Front march through the town on the same day, and it wasn't very pleasant, but, you know, it was very effective, Rock Against Racism, because the sheer numbers of people that came out in support of it, you know, the National Front were sort of marginalised, and they sort of faded away temporarily.
Tom Robinson.
Rock Against Racism was an important movement because it did highlight the fact that the music we were listening to was of black origin, and you can't say we like the music, we don't like the people. By the time we got to 1979, already two-tone was coming in, and the Specials didn't need to play for Rock Against Racism, even though they did, because they were Rock Against Racism. It was a multiracial band, first of many, and, you know, the opening of the flood walls, of course. You know, you have men and women in bands together, you have people of all races in bands together. We're just musicians.
When we did ska, it wasn't just a revival, we were modernising it, we were mixing it with punk, we were making it into a very modern music for the time. It wasn't just a retro thing at all, you know. We didn't go with other record companies because I had this idea for the two-tone label, you know, and I was very much into bands, instead of competing against each other, working together, you know, to create something. So I wanted my own label to give other bands that were playing similar music like Madness and The Beat a chance.
Ranking Roger from The Beat.
Grew up, born and bred in Birmingham, a great community for mixture of cultures, you know, and I was one of the first black punks in Birmingham. I was a punk in 1978. I was already sporting my bondage stuff and getting cussed stuff everywhere I went round town, especially by black people who didn't like to see a black man dressed up as a punk for some reason. Although I always saw it as a fashion thing. With schoolmates, you know, they'd give me punk music to listen to, and I'd give them reggae music to listen to. And we found that, well, actually, they were both singing about the same things, although there were different styles of music. There were a lot of social things going on at the time, like there were a lot of what we call then blues parties or shebeens. Those were the breeding grounds of punk and reggae music being played in the same place. The punks became skinheads, and then the skinheads all of a sudden became rude boys.
And there were the second wave of punk groups, bands like the Ruts and the Members.
Back in 78, you had the Enemy already saying punk was dead. I'm going out seeing new bands all the time, like the Ruts and the Members and the Skids, and you think, how can they say punk's dead? It's there, it's alive, it's got a second wind.
Journalist Gary Bushell.
The bands like the Ruts and the Members were obviously influenced by the first wave of punk, but they also had a reggae influence there too, and they're very much in the bass lines and stuff like that. It was different. It was influenced by, but different, and it was building up its own little momentum, its own little scene.
This is the sound. This is the sound of the summers.
They were just like the bands that the first lot had inspired, but they were all bringing something new to it.
Although some of these bands would end up on major labels, the one thing which hooked many of the emerging groups together was the DIY ethic. One of punk's most important revolutions was proving you didn't need a big record label to release records. Early independent releases like the Buzzcocks Spiral Scratch EP set a new trend for bands going it alone. It also produced the first wave of independent record labels, many inspired by the likes of Stiff Records or the Oval label, which had been born out of London's pub rock circuit. Stiff, one of the early homes for maverick punk bands, seemed to sum up the DIY approach, even if at times the label's practices were a little unconventional. Pete Waterman again.
I loved Dave Robinson. You know, I worked at Stiff. I loved the ethos of the guys at Stiff. The Stiff tours were, to me, inspirational.
Sex and drugs and rock and roll.
You know, again, I was an oddball at Stiff because I like pop music, so there was the beautiful Kirsty MacColl, myself, and Tracy Allman and Peter Collins having a fabulous time. And and any project that Dave couldn't get off, Watermax, get on them Bell Stars there, go sort them Bell Stars out. Anybody who couldn't have a hit, they came down the corridor to Pete Waterman. Hey mate, I got up Waterman, he'll know what to do with them. And the first time I ever met Dave, I always remember, I'd called the office, I got his phone message, could you call Dave Robinson at Stiff? And I called Annie, who was his PA. And she said, he can't talk to you at the moment. He's out on the front of the office with a baseball bat. He's just fighting with the Damned over their record royalties. It was like a classic, like, he'll be back in a minute. I'll get him to ring you back. He's just outside sorting the Damned out with a baseball bat.
Shops started labels, like the legendary Rough Trade and Beggar's Banquet. Scenes produced record labels, like Factory in Manchester, Zoo in Liverpool, Good Vibrations in Belfast, and Postcard Records in Glasgow. It was a whole new avenue for both bands and entrepreneurs.
My name is Damon O'Neill, and I play guitar for the Undertones. Well, we got a lot of abuse for being Derry's only punk band, and in those days, we were considered a joke band, punk rock, my arse. We felt alienated because we were in Derry and we didn't know there was anything going on in Belfast at the time, even though it was only 60-70 miles away. We needed to have a record out to prove who we were, and luckily by summer of '78 we found out about Good Vibrations in Belfast, and good old Terry Hooley gives us a chance. We did Teeny's Kicks EP in Belfast. The reason why we did an EP, we wanted to do value for money, sort of copying Spiral Scratch by Buzzcocks. We felt we were going to break up after that, so this was our legacy. Oh well, if we're going to do it, let's do 4 songs instead of 2. And we just got lucky. Because John Peel really loved it, and things spiraled from there.
Rough Trade boss Jeff Travis.
We were very tuned into the whole do-it-yourself ethic. We liked the idea of that. We'd seen punk come and go. We'd seen the Clash signed to CBS, and we wondered, well, why did they do that? What was the real point of that? And so when people started making their own records, the Buzzcocks, Spiral Scratch, Crass's first singles, all the things that Crass did, we would buy them really literally in the hundreds and sell them in the shop. We would import records that we liked from America. The first Hearth and Perubu singles were really exciting releases. The first Blondie single, which were just classic rock and roll things that we loved, and we'd blast them out in the shop. I mean, it just seemed unusual for so many people cropping up all over the place doing their own things, and that was what we were trying to encourage. We weren't trying to kind of bottle it or encapsulate it or tie it down. We just wanted to encourage it, and the fact that the shop was there and we had a network of other shops that we could talk to and send records to just made that flow really easy, and that was really the point. It was a political point, really. Daniel Miller very, very famously came in the shop one day with a tape of TVOD and Warm Leatherette, which of course he'd done himself, and he played it in the shop, and a very excited sounds journalist called Jane Suck rushed up to the counter and said, "What is this?" And she was just raving about it right from the beginning, and I think it helped Daniel to have the confidence to go and start his own record label.
My name's Daniel Miller and I'm from Mute Records. Before I set the label up, I was kind of inspired by the spirit of punk and kind of electronic music as well. So, that was kind of what was going on in my head at the time when I thought of making my first single. And I really just wanted to put out a single. I didn't think about starting a record company or anything like that. I had no particular thoughts about that. My first aim was just to get a single out, which is what I did. And that's how I got in touch with Rough Trade, because I took some white labels around there. And I didn't think anybody would really like it very much. I didn't know what people would think of the single, but they seemed to really like it, and they said they'd distribute it for me, and that's how I got to work with Rough Trade. It was really simple, and there were loads of people who would tell you who would tell you how to do it as well. You could just phone up Rough Trade shop or one of the other indie shops like Small Wonder, which was another important shop at the time, and say, give us any advice on putting a 7-inch out. So phone up this pressing plant, they'll help you out. I mean, one of the points about all those small labels that started up was that it was actually, if you had the ideas and a bit of idea of what you wanted to do, it was simple, and that was the whole point. It was the kind of demystification of the process, which is a very important part of what those early independent labels was. There was a group called the Desperate Bicycles who'd put out their own single, but distributing it by bike. They did an interview in the Melody Maker telling you exactly how to go about making your own single, and I think that helped a lot. And I think that a couple of people I know kind of were inspired by that article. You get to know people quite quickly, and it was an exciting time. I think there were a lot of people just starting. Factory were getting going at the time, Beggars, 4AD, and I think people began to see there was an alternative to major labels and that it was worth getting involved in,
Martin Mills, boss of Beggars Banquet.
Beggars started in 1977 in a shop on the Earls Court Road. Myself and my then partner decided to put together a shop that was selling new and second-hand records side by side, and through various routes of promoting gigs as well as opening more shops and having rehearsal rooms and so on, we kind of turned into a record label in 77. It was more practicality, to be honest, because we had this rehearsal room underneath our shop in North End Road, Fulham, and most of the punk bands at the time rehearsed there, and this band called the Lurkers, who came from West London, were rehearsing there, and the manager of the shop got friends with them. They needed a manager. We tried to get them a record deal, but at that time there weren't many record labels around, and everyone had already signed one punk band as a kind of insurance policy in case it happened, so we couldn't get them a record deal, and so we thought, well, let's put the record out ourselves. I used to put records in the boot of my car and drive up to Small Wonder in Walthamstow and sell them a box of everything, and down to Lightning in Harrow Road or all over London, just kind of dropping off boxes of records.
Record label boss, Alan McGee.
Then punk came along. It's like you can put out your own record. There's a thing called Rough Trade. Go and see Jeff Travis. I did. He gave me a record deal, as in he let me press up some records, and he distributed them. Creation Records was formed. It was like, do you know what I mean? I mean, that's how it happened. Nobody can underestimate how important Rough Trade as an ideology was way back in the early 80s. I mean, if it wasn't for Rough Trade, really, there would be no Creation, there would be no post-punk, really, because Rough Trade gave it a means of distribution,
The greatest successes of Rough Trade is, I think, hopefully we just encourage generations of musicians to seize the initiative, I mean, I hope, we may have given someone like Bill Drummond, given him some impetus to do what he did, and many, many people like Bill. I think the fact that we were there and we were willing to distribute KLF records, willing to distribute his ambient records, willing to put up with Bill in the nicest possible way, I think that's really healthy. I think that's been a contribution to culture. I mean, he's just the tip of the iceberg, and I think hundreds and hundreds of musicians have really been helped. I mean, the fact that, Echo and the Bunnymen, Teardrops, Jesus and Mary Chain, Smiths, whoever it may be, I mean, people who've contributed to the musical riches of this country in the last years. I think the fact that many of those have been encouraged by the independent system that's been the best thing about it.
Bass monster Peter Hook.
We were so busy with the inception of Factory that you were really sort of riding a crest of a wave, so I suppose we were quite happy with it. We were hip, Factory was hip, the punk thing, the spitting and the gobbing had gone, and you were moving, now I think about it, supposedly to a more serious musical stage. But you were so busy that, and it was so wonderful to have what you wanted to do on a platter delivered to you. Here you go. And you didn't care about anything else. You just wanted to do it. You wanted to get in a transit and drive to Aberdeen. Now you wouldn't go at gunpoint. Do you know what I mean?
That love will tear us apart again.
Ian Ballard from the Damaged Goods label.
Who's on the label? Billy Childish, Holly Golightly. We've done records recently with the Buzzcocks. They're not actually signed to the label, but we do license things off them, and we do odd sort of records. We also reissue a lot of sort of old punk stuff, things like the Killjoys, the Users, and probably far too many others. We also did the first single many moons ago with the Manic Street Preachers. Yeah, I'm actually working with Marco Peroni at the moment, Marco and Chris from Adam and the Ants, and we're doing a couple of singles with their new band, just limited 1,007 inches and whatever. And it's so funny because, you know, they were, you know, Marco's in the band, and, you know, he asked me how the singles go, and I was like, oh, we've done about 700, and he goes, oh, we did like 280,000 in 1 week on, you know, some of these Ants records, and he said, I can't comprehend 700. I said, yeah, I know, it's hardly what I told you it weren't worth doing. You know, really, you're better off sitting on your arse and having the royalties come in. But, you know, bless him, you know, they want to get out and do something.
And it wasn't just record labels either. Prompted by the original punk fanzine Sniffing Glue, fans all over the country started their own magazines. Lawrence Bell, who would go on to start Domino Records and sign Franz Ferdinand and the Arctic Monkeys, was one such DIY scribe.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I would have been about 12 years old in Ipswich, starting to hang around record shops, I suppose, and I bought a fanzine or two locally just from a kid, and another guy just like hanging around the record shop. Oh, do you want to buy my fanzine? It's 10p, you know? And I'd be like, yeah, okay, you know. I bought it and took it home, and I was quite inspired by it, you know, and I read it and I was like, oh wow, this is great, you know. I think I'm going to do something like this, and you know, just total expression, you know. And so, you know, I just wrote about, you know, the 2 gigs I'd been to, and you know, and all the records I'd heard, and you know, some other general stuff. And then I went down the record shop and said, look, photocopied them, you know, maybe at school or God knows where I did it. You know, maybe I think my mum helped me actually. You know, just to hire a photocopy, pretend to buy it. You know, eventually anyway, and you know, for 2 weeks sort of trial period. You know, and then you know, photocopy all the fanzines and say no, it's not the model we're after. You know, something like that. Once it run out of ink and everything. I was really influenced by the original Rough Trade. That was very inspiring for me. As the fanzine got along, I used to go down to London and sell my fanzines to the shop. I'd leave, you know, 20 copies with them, and then I'd go back, you know, a month later, get the train down to London and pick up the money, and somehow they'd sold them. You know, I always figured they must have lost them. They couldn't really have sold them. People in London wanted to read about what was going on in Suffolk, you know. But yeah, they always paid me anyway. And then above the shop there, they had the record label, and you could go up there and interview the bands. The fact that you were taken very seriously as well, you know. I wasn't, you know, patronised or anything, you know. I was totally accepted and taken seriously as a, you know, visiting fan. So I guess there was just forums going on, and there were just people were coming by, fanzine writers, and it was just really genuine and really inspiring. Yeah, so that's that original sort of Rough Trade modus operandi and attitude, you know, and culture is very much what's inspired me.
As more of these outlets opened, and with, of course, the support of John Peel on Radio 1, guitar music continued to evolve. And it wasn't just the new scenes, the ska and mod revivals, new romantics and goths. The music we call or called punk also started reinventing itself in the late 70s and early 80s. As mentioned, there was the post-punk of Gang of Four, a politically driven, jerky dance version on the punk theme, and of course, the lyrical inventiveness of Marquis Smith and The Fall. And that's just a couple. You can insert your own list here. Punk biographer John Robb.
Listen to John Peel in that period was a joy, because they were turning up all these kind of like maverick groups all the time. And the whole argument of punk was ever trying to be original and do something different. So every night you put on a punk record, think, wow, how do you do that? That's slightly different from what was going on before. So everyone be changing what the formula was all the time, really quickly, you know.
I'm Philip Chevron. I play with the Pogues and I play with the Radiators in 1976. Well, the Pogues, I suppose, are and were a punk band, which is perhaps a funny thing to say about men in their 50s, but I mean, to me, James Joyce was a punk rocker, so was Flann O'Brien. These people were all punks in different areas in that they kicked against what the prevailing winds were. And I think the Pogues did that in a number of levels, but not least was that most of us had been in punk bands in the late 70s anyway, and the Pogues moment didn't arrive until sort of mid-80s, when the spirit of punk met a resurgent Irish consciousness in Britain, which resulted in the great noise that we now call the Pogues. It wasn't there, we invented it, but it's easy to assume it was always there, but it wasn't.
Explode bottom mate, don't try to mess!
For punk purists, though, lovers of the original gritty three-chord polemic pop, there were scores of new bands all over Britain by the start of the 80s, some of them from the most unlikely areas. Variously described as new punk and real punk, bands like Sham 69 and the Angelic Upstarts gave birth to groups like the Cockney Rejects in London, followed by Blitz from the Malvern Hills, Vice Squad in Bristol, the Partisans in Wales, Discharge from Stoke, and of course, the Exploited from Scotland, whose Mohican-haired singer Watty became one of the movement's most recognisable figures. The new punk also spawned another offspring, Oi, which drew both punks and skinheads together. The man who invented Oi, Gary Bushell.
Sham 69 had come through in late 77, really started making an impact, and they were different from the other punk bands in that they had quite a populist agenda, and they were anti the rip-off boutiques and stuff like that. Hey Little Rich Boy, it's very much a sort of class-based thing, and they got a different following. They got a following that was more football, they got more skinheads following them, stuff like that. And I think Sham were the band more than anything that inspired what became known as the new punk or real punk or Oi bands. You hear something like the Angelic Upstarts singing Who Killed Little Towers, or the Cockney Rejects singing Fighting in the Streets, and it was so far removed from the first wave of punk as to be something completely different, because this wasn't art school, this was Borstal. It was that was the difference. It was something. I always thought it was for real, because the first generation of punk bands had always claimed to be kids from tower blocks, etc., but it was never quite what they were seeing. They were never quite there. Whereas these new bands that were coming through, they were the reality of the punk mythology, and that's why we were struggling to find new names for them. I think I first called it new punk or real punk, and then Stinky Turner of the Cockney Rejects, he always used to start, instead of saying 1, 2, 3, 4 like the Ramones would have said, he'd always start with Oi, and then so I thought, that's the thing, isn't it? Oi, it's a street shout. It's like, yo, it's just, that's where it came from.
Jeff Turner, also known by his stage name, Stinky.
Sometimes with the Oi thing, I wouldn't want to be associated with that, because my association goes back with the great punk bands, as I said, like Generation X, Night the Dan, etc. What was born out of that was in Leeds in 1980, we played a gig, and there was a review in Music News, and it said the only word Stinky Turner could muster between songs was oi, oi, oi. Taking it, but that's good, that's funny. So we just thought, we'll do a song called Oi, Oi, Oi. We thought it would, through that review. And we got kind of sucked into this thing, and still today, I must admit, but I'd rather be called a punk band, than people turn round. No disrespect to the others who make Oi music, but that's just me personally, and I'll give it from the art. Oi for me it's not really punk, not as what I knew it, and it never was, and it was kind of something that was invented through us, fabricated, and we didn't even want anything to do with it.
The Cockney Rejects had a line in one of the songs which was, the kids they come from everywhere, the East End's all around, which is basically saying, you're all the same, we're all the same, we've all come from the same backgrounds. It was pretty much a sort of working class manifesto, and the bands that they inspired were from all over. Obviously you had some London bands, you had the Business in South London, the Foreskins, who were largely from East London, but you'd also have Infra Riot in North London, you'd have Criminal Class from Coventry, you'd have the bands up in the North East, you'd have bands in Liverpool, it was Wales, Scotland, the Scottish bands were coming through by this time. You had bands like The Exploited, who were attached to the Oi thing because they were new as well and exciting and a bit dangerous, and it just a new phenomenon, it's something genuinely exciting.
Ian Ballard, from Damaged Goods.
I loved Oi. I thought Oi was great. Also slightly moronic. You would get absolute idiots up there, sort of, doing a turn, basically. I won't name any names because I probably know most of them, but, Oi got in the charts. And looking at what they sold then to what bands sell now to get in the charts, these bands would have been number one now if they sold the same amount of records.
I'm Jeff Turner, lead singer of the Cockney Rejects, and you listen to England Still Dreaming on Radio 2.
Offset against this mostly simplistic rhetoric were the anarchist punks, led by Crass.
I'm Penny Rambo, and I was the drummer with Crass. I was writing a poem called Christ Reality Asylum, which was an attack on the state, on organised religion, and on the institution of the family, because I saw those as being the sort of, the obvious oppressive forces, the things that restricted our ability to become the person we wanted to be. It wasn't punk connected in that sense. I mean, it was very punk in its feel. But, Crass sounded like the people who turned up and did it. It certainly wasn't us saying, oh no, I think we ought to get something or other. It just happened. And in fact, there's quite a bit of conflict between Steve and myself over exactly where we should go on occasions, because he was very much reflecting a much more basic sort of clash punky thing, whereas I was always trying to push it towards something like free jazz, or sort of like, my inspiration was far more someone like John Coltrane than someone like Johnny Rotten. So, and I think that shows in the music. What we did, there is this sort of conflict of interest, which I think made it very unique. It made it, we didn't sound like any other band.
Back from the Roxy, okay, I never must supply there anyway.
Generally speaking, we seemed to empty places. I remember playing Chelsea School of Art and just completely clearing it. There's one person left in the audience, which was Eve, who eventually became our female lead vocalist. And that went on for quite a long while. We just emptied places, literally. Particularly if they were connected. The Chelsea School of Art one was sort of like punk connected because it came off the King's Road. So there was a lot of that, the school of punks, which I regard as, like the first wave thing, which I think was very fashion-based, very style-based. And I think already we were sort of seen as some sort of threat to that. We were challenging that whole, the commercialisation of what we saw as being people's music.
Gary Bushell.
I was fascinated by Crass, but I couldn't stand them. I liked the imagery, I liked the anger of them, but to me they were something alien to what I understood as punk. I didn't like the tunelessness of it. I didn't like just the pure racket of it, and I found it all pretty much a new expression of hippie ideals. Really, it was just that whole vegetarian commune business. It didn't really appeal to me much, I've got to be honest.
Not only had punk started squatting in every major town and city in Britain, the Americans were busy reworking punk in their own hardcore image. While the States had largely remained unmoved by the Sex Pistols, the punk ethic had seeped down in the American underground, helped by Johnny Thunders and the Ramones amongst others. The next wave of US punk, however, was whiplash fast and bullishly indignant. Along came the Dead Kennedys, and then, championed by new labels like SST Records, bands such as Minor Threat, Black Flag and Husker Du, who took punk to new extremes of aggression and speed. Domino Records boss, Lawrence Bell.
Interesting records were coming in from America. Things like Black Flag was starting to, and Husker Du was starting to come out in the early 80s, and people were picking up on that certain sort of factions of punk kids, and there was obviously a sort of bigger slant, and then I think more and more kids got interested in that and dug deeper into that world, and that seemed to then be interpreted, and people started forming bands inspired by that, rather than this kind of quite sort of the English punk, hardcore punk scene was going into a kind of a bit of a sort of dead end, and the musicianship wasn't so good, and the American kids just seemed a bit more sophisticated, and maybe they could play better, but they were coming up with some new shapes, and English punk was just seeming a bit grey and stopping to be interesting. There was skateboard culture coming in with it, and they just kind of came out and just started playing really fast, and these great grooves, great hooks and great riffs,
great drumming, you know, and they just sort of wiped the floor with everybody, and everyone was like, yikes, this is good, you know. And so like Husker Du, definitely, early Husker Du, the Minutemen, Bad Brains were huge, and they played half reggae, half punk, you know, they were astounding. Descendants is where this is now, you know, really, because that's Green Day completely copped the Descendants thing. I thought, you know, and look at that, and that has become the biggest band in the world almost, aren't they, them and the Chili Peppers.
Hi, my name is Billy Joe. I play in a band called Green Day.
Hi, I'm Mike Dern. I'm the bass player.
I'm Trey Cool. I'm Billy Joe's drummer.
I think that it never takes one band to kind of keep the scene or keep punk rock, the tradition of it, just sort of keep going through the years. You need to have a lot of bands and playing together and actually supporting each other. And I don't know, that goes just along with like a do-it-yourself ethic that we've always carried on through the entire time we've been a band.
It's like there's always constant flow, as you well know, of new music, you know.
Where we come from has a real like DIY ethic. Like people are really into doing things themselves, booking their own tours, and
you know, we had in the Bay Area there was a lot of sort of places that were around that were pay to play or 21 and over, and for us that would never stop us, and we never wanted to play. We were too young, and so you know we took the matters into our own hands and, you know, booked our own shows and played wherever we possibly could, like in pizza parlors and Masonic temples and youth halls and vets halls and anywhere in parties, people's garages and people's basements, and it was all just to sort of get out and just be able to play in front of people and create some sort of scene around you. And because it wasn't just us, it was a lot of other bands like, you know, Monsula and Operation Ivy and Filth and Blatz and bands like that. So
Lars Fredriksson.
To me, punk rock is just kind of a reaction to what is cool or what's more generally accepted in society. We don't have 9-minute songs, and we're not burnt out old hippies that do cocaine. We're sort of the young rock and roll roots, like Elvis, like the original rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino. You know, I would rather be side by side those guys than you know, somebody like Peter Frampton or something, you know.
Back in the States, the combination of both this hardcore scene and the sound of British post-punks would ultimately help shape America's biggest rock band of the 90s, Nirvana. A fan of Brit groups like the Raincoats and the Slits, Kurt Cobain was a classic slacker punk figure.
People were begging for a band like Nirvana to come around.
Green Day.
Because they're so full of crap for so many years, you know. I mean, you're talking, you know, 12 years just fabricated music, where finally it was just like a breath of fresh air when Nirvana came along, and it was like, you know, and the funny thing is they did it the wrong way. When you sell out, you're not supposed to make a good record. You're supposed to make a bad one, you know. And Nirvana just made this masterpiece of a record, and people were just blown away by it. The most influential record of the 90s, period.
Nirvana producer, Butch Vig.
I think Nevermind definitely changed a lot of people's heads in the music business again, because I think a lot towards the middle of the 80s, a lot of the industry had kind of geared up towards really big rock records, very slick records, a lot of dance stuff, a lot of stuff that was really overproduced, and all of a sudden Nirvana kind of put a lightning rod underneath that and changed everything by making this really electric, somewhat raw, visceral sounding album. The biggest thing is that Nirvana wrote brilliant songs. They really are great pop songs. I mean, it didn't matter if they played it as a rock band or a punk band or if they played it as an acoustic ballad. In fact, one of the arguments that came up between Kurt and I was that he said the Sex Pistols were gods and the Clash sucked, and I was like, no, the Clash wrote great pop songs, you know, much as like you're doing, my friend. And he was like, no, I want to be like the Sex Pistols, I don't want to be like the Clash. And I said, well, you know, you can be like both. You know, you just write your songs, then you just get the right kind of performance down.
Come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be.
You could make a case that Husker Du took hardcore and twisted it with just enough melody to sign to a major label. And once they'd broken the indie mould, so did Sonic Youth, the defiant New York band who signed to Geffen Records. And who did Sonic Youth recommend should be Geffen's next signing? Nirvana again.
1990, I was 21.
Former Nirvana drummer, now of the Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl.
In 1991, this little band that I had joined became really popular, and it was really funny to me. I really never imagined any of that happening. I don't think anybody did. At least the three of us didn't. It was wild. It was really, really strange. To me, I laughed out loud almost every day that you guys knocked Michael Jackson out of #1. Just like, who are the suckers that are buying this album, man? You know, like, this is not supposed to happen.
But as Nirvana's grunge era began to fade in Britain, along came another scene which was well versed in punk and post-punk: Britpop. Blur had a fondness for XTC, Elastica sought inspiration from 77 art punk's Wire, and there was another band who knew the importance of punk. It was part of an ideological arsenal that would make them the biggest group in Britain: Oasis. Alan McGee.
I remember I had an argument with Noel Gallagher on the eve of What's the Story, Morning Glory, and he was at this point obsessed by, because he's younger, and he was telling me that I was a mod. And I was going, I'm a punk, and he's like, you're not a punk. And I'm like, you don't have to dress like a punk to be a punk. I'm a punk. Creation's a punk label. It's a punk rock record label. And he was telling me I was a mod because he's obsessed with Weller. And although I'm absolutely obsessed with Weller, do you know what I mean? Deep down, I know Weller considers himself a mod, but for me, Paul Weller will always be a punk rocker, you know.
Though compared to the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, and even Status Quo, that wall of sound on Oasis's first album could be seen as a direct descendant of Steve Jones's guitar on the first Pistols record. And listen to how Liam snarls, "Sunshine." Where could that intonation have come from? Other British music scenes over the years have also been fuelled or informed by punk. C86, the DIY indie pop scene of the 80s, had the Buzzcocks power pop at its heart. Manchester throbbed with the dysfunctional element of punk gigs. Ambient house was brought to you by former punk fans The Orb, who even recorded a Pistol-style cover of No Fun for an early Peel session. And the KLF, of course, whose Bill Drummond had been there at the birth of punk in Liverpool. And some of you will undoubtedly disagree with this, but even TV shows like Neighbours and wannabe idol programmes like Popstars weren't unrelated to punk. Pete Waterman, the man who'd seen the Sex Pistols at the Marquee and discovered the Specials, went on to set up the PWL label, garnering radio play from John Peel and using the punk template to launch Kylie Minogue.
I'd never understood why journalists never understood that what we were doing was sticking our fingers up to everybody and we were just punks playing pop music. I mean, I always remember, you know, Chris Wright saying that rock and roll was dead, and I'm sort of saying, hang on a minute, I'm out on the road every night, there's 3,000 kids here for £1 and a beef burger, and, you know, they're going balmy. Well, you know, where's the difference? This is what I did with punk, and this is the same. It's just because they're singing I Should Be So Lucky and they're not singing God Save the Queen, but to me it's the same. You know, we're breaking every rule. We're jumping on a bus, we're going to towns that nobody goes to, you know, Barnsley and Accrington. Nobody goes there. We've gone there, and there's riots going on.
Obviously, not everyone would back me on this domino theory of how punk has been behind nearly everything we've heard over the past 30 years. Bob Geldof, for one.
I think, Lamacq, if you'd pardon me, as you're trying to make these completely tenuous connections with punk and the entire history of the planet.
But for me, so much of today's pop music has been touched by punk, one way or another. While scores of first and second wave punk bands have reformed or are still touring today, even the new music has held up the past for all to see. One of this year's biggest singles to date says it all. Green Day and U2's collaboration on The Saints Are Coming. Bono.
You should ask Edge about that. He's got this thing called Music Rising, which is to get musical instruments to the musicians in the Delta area there, New Orleans, that lost all their instruments in Katrina and the flood. Jazz musicians, blues musicians, and Green Day are mates of ours, and we worked with them on Live 8 and stuff like that, and they're just funny, smart, three people you just want to be in the room with.
Green Day, America's first big commercial punk band. U2, the classic Irish new wave group who grew into arena stars. The Saints Are Coming, originally a song by Scottish punks The Skids.
A lot of the lyrics were about a deep frustration in the geographic place we came from, which was the east of Scotland, north of Edinburgh, in a kind of rural outpost called Fife.
Skids frontman Richard Jobson.
A lot of my mates were joining the army because they wanted to become car mechanics or engineers. They certainly didn't want to go to any war zone with a rifle in their hands, and within 20 weeks that's what they did. They were in the Falls Road, or they were in the Divis Flats, the kind of places that, that must have been pretty terrifying at the time. And The Saints Are Coming is essentially about a young kid phoning his dad up in the future, knowing that his father's been killed in a particular situation. So, and it was inspired by a friend being shot in the north. So, it was strange times, turbulent times, and it was written with a lot of passion and a lot of heart.
It's some pretty inspired piece of, post-punk rock.
U2 as a band, they're quite a magnificent force. They have completely reinvented themselves, sometimes in very subtle ways from album to album, but they've always gone out there and tried something. They've managed to just capture the zeitgeist, capture the little murmurs in the movements and tune into it, and they make themselves valid. And I think they've done that quite clearly because they care, and secondly because they're incredibly romantic. So, romanticism's never going to go away whether you like it or not. And people who care, wow, what a brilliant combination. So for them to apply those qualities to a song we wrote in a back bedroom in Dunfermline as a bunch of kids who couldn't get a job, as a little homage to dead friends, is quite something.
This is Manny, bass player from Primal Scream, and you are listening to England's Still Dreaming on Radio 2. Every now and again you get movements, I think every generation needs their own thing, and I'm waiting for the next one now to see, it must be exciting to be 14 again in this country, because there's a lot of young bands coming out with a good bit of attitude. For example, we're going out on tour next week with the Scream, and we've got this young band called The View who are coming out with us, and they sound like a cross between Gen X and the Buzzcocks. And they're just some young 18, 19-year-old kids from Dundee in Scotland. So we're giving them a chance now, and I think kids are going to be amazed. They're a great little band, and be warned, they're coming to a town near you with us. These poor kids, do they really know what they've let themselves in for?
So, as someone once said in the lyric of a song, punk's not dead, pass it on. Peter Hook.
The legacy of punk for me is just to be able to be like a teenager all the time, like smacking Richard Branson's ass, and he's not going to do anything about it because you're in New Order, you know what I mean? He can't do anything about it. And it's things like that. It's just the fact that you can still take a bit of that devil-may-care attitude with you.
Marco Peroni.
Is the legacy goth? Is the legacy Nirvana? Is the legacy Marilyn Manson. I don't know, it's kind of all those things, but more I think the legacy is kind of that attitude of mind where I think the legacy is actually Big Brother. You know, it's to see, like, let's put a bunch of terrible people together and see how awful they can be, and we'll watch it. You know, breaking every convention of taste and just terrifying train smash on television. It's just making things as bad as you can, and people are loving it.
Alan McGee.
I think punk's about... I actually truly don't care on any level what anybody else in the world thinks of me. My parents kind of made me a punk rocker, right? And like, I was dysfunctional in a way that I just wanted to tell them to go f*** themselves on a continual basis.
Acclaimed photographer Jill Furmanowski.
I think punk left a permanent legacy on the music business, which is less to do with the chords played than a sort of attitude. I'm very grateful to punk for having given me a break, for making me realise that if you trained for 2 weeks you could be a photographer, if you played 3 chords you could be in a band, and I think that's probably still my philosophy today.
Manny.
I think punk rock gave a lot of people a platform to get out there and do it, you know, and we all still have the same kind of ideology and ethics of not trusting anybody, you know, governments-wise and stuff like that, and questioning everything and trying to do things on your own terms.
And we don't care.
Hazel O'Connor.
It turned the music industry inside out, turned the fashion industry inside out, and it launched the likes of me and many other girls who probably would never have got a look in because we didn't have beautiful model looks into the music industry. You know, energy was how it was judged.
Jed Doherty, CEO of Sony BMG.
A musician I met who was a lot older than me, and he was a classically trained musician. I think he embraced the spirit of punk as I would like to think I did at the time, and still do to a certain degree. And that is that anything is possible. And he used to say to me, Jed, men can go to the moon. If men can go to the moon, we can do anything. And it was so true. That philosophy has held me in good stead.
Pete Wiley.
I saw the Tommy Kitten wearing an MC5 t-shirt on top of the pops, and when I see people wearing a Clash t-shirt, in fact there was a TV show and there were in the audience, there were 200 people, 3 of them had Ramones shirts on, but punk rock's legacy was the attitude, and it was about freedom and independence and the power of the individual.
Billy Bragg.
All I wish is that every kid who's 19 years old could feel the way I did when I saw the Clash at that age, and come away from seeing them as empowered as I felt that my generation were going to go out and make a difference.
Damien O'Neill.
The legacy of punk, I think the fact that this punk programme about punk rock is actually on Radio 2. Enough said.
This is BBC Radio 6 Music.
6 Music has always been a great place where you can hear a lot of different music up against each other. The odd little songs that you've never heard before.
It gives young and up-and-coming artists a real platform.
It's new by JJ Doom, that's on Lex Records.
6 Music has always been very supportive to the Maccabees. I think Steve Lamacq gave us our first ever radio play.
It's what we do.
A music-loving radio station.
It's public service broadcasting at its best.
You get such a range of sessions, of interviews. What is it that keeps you working?
We don't work music, we play music.
By turn, 6 Music is entertaining, touching and hilarious.
A new phone, everyone! This will save the economies of the West.
What about global environmental catastrophe?
Shut up! Just buy it!
This is 6 Music with me, Lauren Laverne.
I'm Steve Lamacq.
Radcliffe and Maconey.
High octane, double act interplay. Mark Riley on 6 Music.
I'm Chris Hawkins.
The Sean Keaveney Breakfast Show.
Tom Ravenscroft. You're with me, Gideon Coe. This is BBC Radio.
6 Music.
Jack is one, Jenny is a run, but we're trying to balance on the